Welcome, Chosen X. You cross a threshold that feels like a soft cracking of ice beneath steady feet. The room you enter remembers you differently than you remember it. Something in the air registers a change, and strangers become witnesses to a measure you did not place there. You do not announce arrival with fanfare. Your presence is quieter than applause but heavier than rumor. It slides into focus like an instrument finely tuned, and what was once muddled finds clarity by proximity. The earliest recognition is not from a speech or a deed. It is a subtle alignment that happens when someone nearby steadies. Time, which had once felt like a blunt instrument, thins and responds to the rhythm you hold. People sense a new axis at the center of ordinary days. Some approach with curiosity, others recoil as if light has exposed a seam in their costume. Both reactions are truthful. Your being reveals what their evenings have blurred. You built small sanctuaries of care in places that would never attest to them. Nights spent listening, decisions made without spectacle, a steadying hand given without expectation of return. These are the quiet acts that accumulate into gravity. They did not register as currency. They were not minted for recognition. They were structural, part of an unseen framework that kept certain connections upright. When that framework is removed, the architecture shows its true integrity. People often confuse access with abundance. Something offered consistently is mistaken for infinite supply. In this mistake they become careless. They arrange temporary comforts to mask what was lost. At first those diversions feel like reconstruction. Later they reveal themselves as mere scaffolding placed over an empty room. The emptiness that follows your absence is specific. It is not a general ache. It is the recognition that a particular steadiness has left the field. Seeing the truth of what you once were is a slow unpeeling for most. At first it was a nagging impression. Then it becomes an inability to settle into routine. A joke fails to land the way it once did. A shoulder that used to carry slackness now seems absent. When distraction runs out they stare at what remains and notice that the weight of care you carried was a kind of secret labor. Their regret is not a drama you perform in response. It is a private climate they inhabit. You do not mistake their later sorrow for your responsibility. You have learned to move without taking debris as ballast. Leaving was not an abandonment of duty, though it may have looked like refusal. It was a precise act of self-protection and fidelity. You cleared space not to punish but to preserve. In that clearing your sense of proportion returned. You discovered that generosity without discernment breeds a slow erosion. There is conservation in grace. Fire returns as a metaphor because it names two truths at once. Fire gives by warming and it clarifies by burning away what cannot serve. Your brightness does not exist to shame. It exists to reveal. Those who have cultivated comfort in shadow find the flame intolerable. Those prepared for heat draw nearer with steady steps and renewed appetite for honesty. You do not smother warmth to make avoidance possible. You sustain the temperature that allows true work to begin. In the afterlight you notice a softness within that was masked by constant tending. Absence prunes performative shapes. Freed from the expectation to perform, you notice how your heart shifts its geometry. You breathe with more room. The muscles that learn to brace relax. Walking becomes less about proving and more about listening to new ground. This is not a flight. It is a translation of labor into language the rest of your life can understand. Some will try to return with explanations and small rituals meant to rebuild trust quickly. Expect ceremonies of apology that look efficient and tidy. You will recognize them as rehearsals if the underlying structure has not altered. Forgiveness for you is an art that requires clarity and limits. It is not an open door without new foundations. It is the placing of a window where once there was a hole, a portal that admits light without surrendering order. Boundaries become an expression of respect for the life you hold. At the close of this part stand with a posture that is neither defensive nor defeated. You claim a latitude for your own movement. You are the curator of the light you carry. Invite companions who will attend to your frequency, who will practice the craft of being present in the way attention itself deserves. Leave behind those who prefer a lamp you always supply. This passage is the first clear chapter in a story where belonging must now meet you on honest terms rather than petition for charity. Go forward with the stern delight of someone who has returned to a home they built themselves, aware that every open door henceforth must be chosen rather than presumed. Keep to that light. You feel the shift as pressure under a calm surface, a subterranean current you cannot unhear. The days you thought were steady were animated by a cadence you did not recognize until now. People move around you like tide and reef, testing shoals and returning with fragments of their navigation. You notice that your influence arrives earlier than your words. It is the accumulation of choices made without spectacle, the slow accretion of dependable responses given in quiet corners. At moments you realize that the world bends around an axis you hold and does so with no fanfare. There is a precision to how situations resolve near you, as if proximity itself negotiates outcomes. Some respond with gratitude that is quiet and lasting. Others recoil, unsettled by the truth that a steady hand forces into view. In their discomfort they invent substitutes that mimic motion without providing support. Those substitutes fail because they were never built to sustain pressure. Your interior becomes a compass with a needle that flickers toward integrity. You begin to perceive the economy of attention in new currency. Where you once gave freely without calculation, you now measure with tender exactness. This is not a retreat into scarcity. It is a form of stewardship that protects the energy you have learned to value. You discover that calibration can be generous and fierce at once. It is the capacity to say yes from fullness and no from sovereignty. The people who had access to your steadiness now experience a winding ache, a barren cadence they cannot plug with novelty. They pursue bright moments that glitter but do not warm. Their attempts appear frantic because they confuse motion with repair. In private they replay gestures they took for granted, testing memory for clues that might explain why the scaffolding collapsed. You watch these developments from a space of measured compassion and clear distance. Compassion here is not indulgence. It is the sober noticing that some will use time to adapt and some will not. You resist the desire to return simply to relieve others. You accept that your departure is part of a larger economy of learning. The absence is an instrument. It clarifies who is present by choice and who remain from habit. You confront the mirror of your own expectations. There is a temptation to test loyalty by re-entering fractured scenes to see whether repair is possible. That temptation reveals more about the boundaries you have yet to learn than it does about the characters you left behind. Testing another person is often a rehearsal for control. You no longer require rehearsals. Symbolic echoes accentuate the interior landscape. You imagine a vessel used daily and taken for granted until the day it is set aside. Only when the vessel is absent do others notice the scale of what it contained. This image repeats across small moments, each one amplifying the sense that routine can mask craft. Your influence is craft. You are artisan and anchor, and the recognition of that craft will arrive slowly to those who allowed themselves to become dependent on it. Conflict in this chapter is quieter and more internal than before. Instead of dramatic ruptures you encounter slow dissolutions that reveal character and gradient. You learn to observe rather than to repair. Sometimes observation is the most active choice you can offer because it refuses to engage in cycles that diminish. You accept that the work before you is not to chase lost gratitude but to cultivate places where true reciprocation can be practiced. Practices begin to form. You establish rituals that preserve your orientation. These practices are small gestures with large effects. They include checking in with your own threshold before offering presents, allowing rest to be a decision rather than an accident, and clarifying agreements in language that does not rely on assumption. Such practices are radical because they counter the cultural habit of diffuse giving. They create a different grammar for intimacy. The outer world continues to spin its attempts at substitution, but your inner laws hold. You notice that those who adapt to your standard begin to appear in subtle ways. They arrive with patience and curiosity and stay long enough to match the rhythm you set. These are not replacements. They are companions of a new order. Their presence tests neither your light nor their own worthiness. By the end of this section you understand the depth of what you preserved. You are no longer surprised by who returns empty-handed and who arrives carrying a different steadiness. The lesson is muscular. You have trained a capacity to steward your power without spectacle. From here the path deepens into terrain where the preservation of integrity will ask for clearer sacrifices and fiercer tenderness. You meet those demands with steady attention. Restraint will read as generosity, and tenderness will demand a discipline that is both kind and unyielding. Stay steady. You stand at the edge of an interior storm, where everything that once seemed settled shifts beneath the low, persistent hum. The change is not theatrical. It is the gentle, inexorable rearrangement of priorities inside your chest. You listen to small signals once ignored. Breath is a compass. Pause is permission. The world does not respond but reveals. In that revelation you are witness and weather. Patterns you trusted begin to thin like fabric left too long in the sun. Familiar faces retain their warmth but lose the automatic weight they once carried. Some people continue to orbit your life with routine gestures that once comforted them, now only signal absence. Others step forward with a new steadiness that asks less of your explanation and more of your presence. You learn to distinguish between gestures that are reflex and gestures that are chosen. There is a gravity in recognizing that your clarity provokes two reactions that are mirror images of a single fear. One produces frantic attempts to replace the space you occupy by piling noise over hollow places. The other produces withdrawal, a slow contraction that prefers the shelter of familiar illusions to the risk of facing a truer self. Neither path produces repair. Both reveal where courage was absent. This chapter asks you to confront echoes that were once forbidden. You see them not as accusations but as archives. Each echo holds a record of what was tolerated when generosity was mistaken for endlessness. The archive is painful because it catalogs neglect. It is necessary because it maps the seams you will now mend in other ways. The work is to translate grief into architecture so that future exchanges will be honest and serviceable. You practice new forms of speech with the people you keep near. Sentences that used to be polite evasions are replaced by short, clear statements that hold room for complexity without surrendering your bandwidth. You do not weaponize clarity. You use it to calibrate exchange. You teach by example how proximity can operate with reciprocity rather than dependence. The teaching is tender and rigorous at once. It asks for productivity from the heart and discipline from affection. A particular kind of mirror appears during this interval. It is not the glass that flatters. It is the surface that corrects posture. It reveals habits of concession, the tiny ways you diminished in order to make a passage easier for someone else. In front of this mirror you rehearse refusal and inclusion as twin practices. You learn to close some doors and to open others with an equal measure of care. Each decision builds a spine for your days. Confrontation in this part is often silent. It arrives as changed arrivals and absences that accumulate into a message. A dinner that no longer holds old laughter teaches more than a midnight argument. A neighbor's polite avoidance reveals patterns of cost that were previously invisible. You register these shifts with a kind of administrative calm. You catalog without rancor and then design systems that prevent further erosion. You are not plotting revenge. You institute stewardship. The inner dialogue grows sharper. You interrogate the myths that once justified endless giving. You test the assumption that your labor must always be visible to be meaningful. Those myths fracture under scrutiny. You find that consistency is valuable but not inexhaustible. You adopt a language for care that includes limits, and you discover that limits are a form of fidelity to the self and to others. Boundaries are not walls against life. They are the scaffolding for honest intimacy. Throughout the chapter you are learning a new grammar of entry. Not everyone who asks may receive admission. Not every apology suffices for immediate trust. Some gestures must be observed over time. Some promises must be enacted through behavior rather than speech. This is measured compassion. It honors both the growth of others and the preservation of your own capacity. It refuses the illusion that suffering is currency for continuing to give away what replenishes you. You notice that as you hold this posture your field subtly rearranges. People who cannot meet the new terms distance themselves. Their absence clarifies rather than diminishes you. Those who adapt appear with humility and a steady rhythm of reciprocity. They do not demand proof of your value. They show up in ways that align with the steady beat you now recognize as necessary for shared life. At the end of this part you will have practices that translate integrity into daily forms. Rituals of check-in and rest will protect your attention. Agreements will be clear and renegotiable. Presence will be offered from fullness, not default. In learning to manage the echo, you free yourself from carrying responsibility for other people's reckonings. The world will continue to murmur and shout, but your interior economy will have a new language and a new currency. Keep speaking it. You move now into the place where intention and consequence meet and the work widens beneath your feet. The passage you have kept private opens into a chamber where memory, decision, and possibility converse without hurry. You encounter the gravity of choice, not as accusation but as fact. Choices are the architecture of meaning. They build rooms where truth can live. In this part of the journey you become steward of what you have given and guardian of what you will allow. The world you left in order is not the world that receives you now. Scenarios that once resolved through your steadiness wobble and require inventions you did not provide. This is both revelation and reckoning for those who depended on the pattern you carried. They discover their unpracticed muscles and must either learn to use them or accept disruption as a consequence. You observe without glee. You are not interested in punishment. You are curious about capacity. Inside you a reorganizing occurs. Old reflexes that bent you toward accommodating others begin to relax. The muscles that tighten in expectation loosen into a readiness that does not presuppose servitude. The change shifts how daily encounters land. You are less available to perform comfort and more available to enact presence on terms that honor your limits. Your readiness to be useful pairs with a refusal to become the sole source of order. Symbols gather into a slow grammar. A lantern becomes more than light, it is an emblem. A bridge becomes more than crossing, it is a covenant. A table set for a company becomes a test of mutuality. These images shape how you will tell the next chapter of your life. Ordinary things become metaphors for systems you intend to hold: hospitality with reciprocity, assistance with accountability, care with boundaries. You encounter tests of endurance disguised as familiar requests. A friend returns with a crisis that looks identical to moments you have soothed, and the temptation to ease into the old response is strong because it is easier than redesigning solutions. Resist that temptation. The new work requires innovations commensurate with the scale of what you once provided. Repeating prior patterns keeps the younger structures in place. Your task is to invent ways of relating that honor reciprocity and preserve dignity. Language sharpens. You no longer defer clarity for comfort. Sentences become promises rather than evasions. Conversations that used to end in polite ambiguity now close with clear agreements. This alteration is not harsh. It is merciful because it spares both parties the slow attrition of misunderstanding. Honesty conducted with kindness preserves the possibility of durable intimacy. Some relationships will not endure these new terms. When conditions change, the fit changes. Recognize that absence can be a covenant in reverse. It reveals what connection required and whether both parties were prepared to meet that need. Losses that once felt like failures begin to read as clarifying events that reduce noise and allow what remains to be discerned more easily. At moments you will be tempted to prove that your absence did not matter by returning to the old economy of attention. Do not. The proof you need is not external approval but an internal tally that measures alignment between action and value. When you act because you are aligned rather than obligated, your steps have a pulse others recognize as authentic. This is how authentic reciprocity is cultivated. It is not performed for display but lived as practice. You will find allies who understand the new grammar. They arrive not as saviors but as co-practitioners who match the rhythm you sustain. With them you construct rituals of shared care that honor time, energy, and intention. Rituals in this sense are practical agreements, the ways you check in, the manner you accept support, the tempo by which you repair harm. These practices become the scaffolding of a small and resilient community. The deeper work in this section is the acceptance of consequence as a form of teaching. When systems collapse or people stumble, the result is not merely loss. It is information. You read those outcomes and adapt your approach. You learn which investments yield mutual return and which siphon resources without replenishment. This discernment is not stinginess. It is wisdom, a method for stewarding what you were given to hold. By the end of this part, you will have drafted practices that translate intention into habit. You will have set language for entry and exit, methods for restoring balance that do not require sacrifice as proof, and agreements that treat care as shared responsibility rather than unilateral gift. You move forward less reactive and more deliberate, less available for repair and more available for co-creation. In this core, you become both artist and administrator of the life you intend to live. Steady and luminous you. You arrive at the threshold of revelation as if stepping into a cathedral of weather. The small signs that collected like driftwood have become a map. Each token you once ignored now reads like a constellation. You can see the scaffolding of cause and consequence assembled into architecture. You have reorganized the lens through which you attend. You recognize that the depth you carry did not vanish when doors closed. It rearranged into an economy that honors thresholds. In this place you stand not as someone waiting to be repaired but as an instrument whose tuning changes a room. The cost for others is not punishment. It is the demand that they learn to hold weight without relying on your constant presence. Here the language of obligation gives way to covenant. You do not legislate love. You set terms for how life and attention enter your field. Those terms require steadiness, not spectacle, presence, not consumption, repair, not substitution. When commitments are kept, they are building materials. When omitted, the absence instructs who remained by convenience and who remained by choice. Your witness is steady. You watch the slow algebra of habit change. People who once took for granted must now do the labor of learning. Some will rise to the demand, cultivating capacity and humility. Some will repeat old patterns and discover the structures that enabled them have been removed. Neither outcome indicts you. They are information that teaches where to invest and where to refrain. At the center of this chapter, a choice opens that matters more than any apology offered later. You may reopen gates to those who return with clarity and enact change, or you may preserve a horizon that refuses to be cluttered by repeated lapses. Both paths are honorable when chosen from full knowledge. The inner climate shifts as you practice new forms of generosity. Generosity now appears in rhythms that restore rather than deplete. You give with patterns of renewal. You attend to your edges so you may serve without erosion. Your work becomes a long arc of sustainable care. To steward the light you carry, you must design systems that keep the flame tended without collapsing into codependence. Solitude becomes a chamber where your voice clarifies. Silence sounds like language. In solitude you collect lessons and forge practices. You learn to hold grief without letting it define your architecture. You fold memory into scaffolding that supports the next season. A ritual of return is possible but different from repetition. A return that honors the new terms requires demonstrations of sustained practice. Words are introductions to work. The work rewrites the ledger. When someone shows up with humility over time, the welcome you offer will be measured by evidence of change. When longing urges you to accelerate the timeline, pause and examine the proof offered. Is it driven by convenience or by transformation? Do gestures carry a new interior logic or resume a script that enables exhaustion? Discernment is vital. Do not mistake eloquence for endurance. At the edge of revelation you are not alone. Companions appear who understand the grammar you practice. They do not ask you to shrink. They do not expect light to be dimmed for comfort. They show up in ways that match the rhythm you sustain. With these allies you construct a life that is not merely protected but generative. Together you design agreements that honor time, attention, and the mutual work of repair. Toward the close of this journey there is a bright, unafraid openness. Freedom becomes not absence but careful abundance. To keep the lamp clear you sometimes extinguish flames that only pretended to be warm. In this paradox you find kind-hearted sovereignty. You are decisive and merciful in equal measure. Now a final invitation appears that belongs to the shape of the work itself. The center of your screen will reveal a short moving image crafted as an extension of this message. There the themes you encountered will continue in visual language and in a deeper register of sound and silence. The video is not an addendum but a continuation of the revelation. Watch it as study rather than spectacle. Carry forward what you reclaimed and let it shape small, bold choices. If the urge rises to keep this path visible for future return, choose to subscribe and enable alerts so that when new transmissions arrive you may receive them without missing a beat. This is not solicitation. It is a practical offering for those who intend to stay aligned. The notifications will not demand attention, they will simply make access seamless when you are ready. Step forward with the clarity you cultivated. Hold what you learned as both a tool and mercy. The work ahead will ask more of you and of those who would remain near, but it will also invite honest companionship and a life arranged around mutual stewardship. Move into that life with feet that rest in truth and hands that keep the steady work of tending.